Right, we're back for our fourth session, and today is the 24th of March 1995, and we're continuing our conversation where we left off, which was in the early days in Canberra. You were telling us on the last occasion about how it was when you first arrived and how you spent a few days in a hostel or a sort of an accommodation, and then fairly quickly were provided with some options in terms of government housing, including a place in Hughes, and the place you eventually selected was in...
we were offered Hughes, but we didn't take it.
Didn't say that you did, but just said you were looked at Hughes, decided to go for Downer. So that's where we were, and I do want to return to that stream, but before we sort of go too far down that road, there is one topic that I wanted to discuss with you that I should have probably raised earlier. You may not have any specific recollections, but I wanted to ask you about what you knew about Dad's war service, and in particular whether he spoke to you about it in any detail or at all about what he had been up to during the war.
Not much. I guess it's the questions I asked. I did find out that he was obviously underage. He had to get his mother's permission to go. They were living in Mudgee, I believe, at the time. And as I said, he got his mother's permission to join the Air Force. And what I know of his Air Force time was...
Do you know why he went for the Air Force compared to any other?
No, I don't. He never did say why he chose that. And he said he served his time in Tarakan. They were fighting the Japanese at that time. That is literally all I know.
So the Battle of Tarakan is a small island off the east coast of Borneo.
Borneo, yeah.
And it was the site of a bloody but ultimately futile battle in May 1945. So the war in Europe was either almost over or over, and the war in Japan against the Japanese was still continuing. But an end perhaps was in sight, although exactly how it would finish at that stage was unclear. And MacArthur had asked the Australians to take Tarakan in order to use it as a base for the operation of a military air-based operation further up into the Philippines and elsewhere.
Yeah, I knew that much. Maybe your father was part of that late bit, because he never talked to me about those sort of major battles. But then again, when you think about it, he didn't talk to me about it at all, other than to say where he was living when he joined, and that he joined the Air Force, and that while he was... I believe he might have been in Brisbane a while before they were actually posted to Tarakan.
Now, the curious thing is that we've looked at his actual war records, and there's no record of him being in Tarakan. The record is that he was briefly in a location on the main island of New Guinea, and then was on another island, a different island, in the Indonesian archipelago. So, can you explain that in any way?
No, well, I am confused, because that is the only story that he told me. I know nothing other than he was in Tarakan. And really, he didn't discuss it much more than that.
And his friend Frank Ireland had also been in the thick of things in the Second World War as well?
Yeah, but he was in the army, and he was in frontline.
He did some heavy duty.
Yeah, in fact, he is carrying shrapnel in his leg. Yeah.
But he was fighting in the islands as well, wasn't he?
I don't know where he was. I don't know that... I think he might have been in Europe. I'm not sure. I don't know his history at all, other than I know he was injured and that he was in the army, not the Air Force.
Right. Okay. Anyway, and then in the immediate aftermath of the war, you don't really know much about what he did, other than eventually being employed in the Australian government because of the return services employment schemes.
Yeah, I think that might have been the way he got into immigration. He did talk, I remember him telling me about when they got back to Australia, how they came from, I don't know if it would be Brisbane, I think. They came by train down to Sydney, and him telling me that the way they slept on the train was up in the racks, you know, where you put luggage. He said that they used to sleep up there in the train on the way down. So that's how they got back to Sydney.
So his war records show that he didn't officially demob or delist from the Air Force until 1946, and that he remained in the islands for almost an entire year after the war finished.
Right.
Do you have any recollection of that?
No.
Or any understanding
No.
of that? What happened during that time?
No, I just know what I told you, you know. That's what he did. It's very limited when you think about it, but I suppose it was enough for me at the time. I'm not sure.
Well, there were a lot of men in those days who had World War II stories that they either were a bit reluctant to talk about or just didn't want to share.
I think they were reluctant to talk about them because they were really heavy experiences that they didn't need or didn't want to go through again.
Yes. He was a sort of working, as far as we can tell, as a sort of a transport person down, because he was in the Air Force, he was near an airbase.
Yeah.
He was driving trucks and moving things around rather than being up in the front lines.
Yeah, I do remember him saying that. That's true. That's the sort of service he did, was transport.
But they were in an area, they were in a war zone. There was definitely...
the Japanese were on their doorstep. Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, the whole thing is a little bit of a mystery at the moment because we haven't got a complete overlap between your recollections and what appears to be the official record.
How do you do that? How do you find out? Exactly.
Well, at the end of the day, the official record is the one that's probably the one that we have to rely upon because, you know, it's a signed off official report on his movements during the war.
So where did the Tarakan story come from?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, he never said Tarakan to me, I don't think, or maybe he did and I've forgotten.
Well, I would have never known that name unless I was told it.
Yes, yeah. All right, well, anyway, let's just park that as a thing to follow up on at another time. I want to now come back to where we left off, which is that period when you've just arrived back in Australia after the 3.5 or almost 4 years in Germany, and you've now got Annette as well as me, and you've made the decision, and you've explained the reasons behind it, to move to Canberra instead of returning to Sydney. And so you were pioneering the sort of rather undeserted sheep paddocks of Canberra in the early 1960s.
It was. There
Not
was
many people here at all.
a lot of thistles, in fact, growing in the ground in the garden of what we had in Downer. And somebody told me that there used to be a thistle farm there once. Why you'd have a thistle farm, I wouldn't know. But certainly
They grew well.
they were growing up in our garden till we got rid of them. Yeah.
And when you moved into the house, was it good to go, or did it still have some things to finish off?
No, it was good to go. Yeah, there was nothing to do. All we had to do was carpet it and furnish it, which we did.
So where did you go to buy your carpets and furniture?
There really wasn't a lot in Canberra at the time. There was a store like Harvey Norman, but I don't think it was. I don't know.
Young's existed in those days. Was it? Was in its heyday?
May have been. I can't remember the store, but I remember we had to go and get carpet because of it being so cold in Canberra, we were advised that you needed to carpet the floors rather than timber them or sand them, because they were timber floors, because there was gaps in the timber and the cold from underneath the house would come through. So the first thing you did was carpet. So we did that, and then we furnished. I have no idea of what particular store was. I know it was very, very limited, because even when we came here, we ended up furnishing mostly from Sydney.
But there have been many people in the same situation, all moving into Canberra in that time when there was quite a large growth in the population, all trying to find furniture from the same limited number of stores.
Yeah, I think they possibly ended up doing what we ended up doing eventually, and that was going to Sydney to get your furniture.
Right. And I have a vague recollection of going to a preschool in Cotton Street down do you remember that?
I do.
So what was that?
Yeah, I vaguely sort of remember it, because you weren't there all that long. You chose not to be there all that long, it would seem, having I can't remember you being that, and maybe it was because you were there for a short time and then we were reposted.
Right. And the other event that sticks in my mind from those early years is the Great Snowfall of 1965. Do you remember that?
That was Christmas, wasn't it?
No, Christmas is the middle of summer.
I know, but we had snow in Canberra on Christmas Day.
No,
well,
it was the middle of winter. But
anyway, you can check it.
There was a large blanket of snow all over Canberra.
Yeah, and we've got photos of you.
And we were the one kids in the street that had proper snow clothes. And toboggans as well.
Yeah, that's right.
Although why we brought toboggans back from Germany, I have no idea.
Maybe we thought we'd go to the mountains because we do have snow not far from here.
Anyway, so there's pictures of me and Annette now, sort of rather
little red suits,
snowsuits.
Yeah.
And lots of Australian kids standing around freezing in their shorts and thongs, and people looking very. The other thing I had as a memory of Germany was my lederhosen.
Yes.
And Annette had a pair as well.
Yeah, and I really liked them. I got them in. Was yours green? I think it was.
So Annette's were red.
Yeah, I got them in those colours because I thought they'd be really nice for play gear when you came back to Australia, and you did use them until you grew out of them. I don't know what I ever did with them. Possibly gave them to someone after.
Yes, but they were a little bit of a talking point with the other kids in the street because having leather pants was not that common in those days.
No, it wasn't. It was quite different. Yeah. Anyway, you didn't mind wearing them. You were happy to wear them, in fact.
So I started off at Rosary School, which was the nearby Catholic parish primary school up in Watson on Phillip Avenue, corner of Phillip Avenue and Anthill Street, and began kindergarten there in 1965. Do you remember the lead up to that and what was going on?
No, just that it was partly settling into Canberra, I guess, that you got your children sorted and the place for you to go was, it was a Catholic school and that's what we wanted to do. And they had a kindergarten and you went there. And then shortly after Annette went there. And
a year later.
Yeah. And you stayed there for how many years?
Just 2 years.
Yeah, until we moved again.
Kindergarten in first grade there.
Yeah, and then we moved again.
So I remember those 2 years as being quite productive for me because I don't know why exactly, but I sort of just got it in terms of how to read and things like that very quickly and found school quite easy.
I have a memory of you actually getting ideas of how to read even before you went to school. I can remember a packet of cornflakes on the breakfast table and you trying to work out how to read what was on that. So you were already getting a hang of how to read before you went to school, so you did pick it up quickly.
Yeah, and I found the whole learning experience pretty good, and school itself was fine. I didn't feel like I was harassed or there was targeted in any way.
It was a good school actually, and then Annette followed you. She had a little difficulties because of they thought she was dyslexic. In fact, someone that I got to assess her here actually in Kingston said that he did not think it was that. He thought because we were living in a country where she was having to speak French and English that...
We're in Canberra at this stage. We're nowhere near France at this stage.
Well...
We're talking about 1966.
Before. Sorry. Yeah, I was thinking of when she came back and you went to that school again.
I went straight to Darren and came back. But anyway, and I recall we used to just toddle off out the front door ourselves in the morning and walk to school many days. Seems like a strange thing in 2025, but we just walked to school, crossed the roads, and in the second year I used to just go with Annette. In other years I would sometimes go with some friends who lived on the same street.
Yes, and I can remember we had a Mercedes then, so we must have come back from Germany.
No, you had a Citroen.
Yes, but we also had a
Mercedes came out after France.
Yeah, we bought an opposite
1966 is a
Citroen. Yeah, I can remember going to sort of pick you up from school and you asking me not to do that. That you did want to walk home with those friends that you'd made at school who used to walk home across the paddock with you. There was a paddock and also a sort of a playground that you used to walk home across. And I remember you not wanting me to go and pick you up. Don't do it. I embarrassed you, you told me.
Yeah. Well, you had that weird car.
You'd rather be with your friends than with me.
And so what were you doing during these times? Obviously you had a child under you.
Yeah, well, I was at home because I had Jane as a baby in those days.
She was born in May 65, so shortly after I started school she arrived. So you were mostly just looking after the house and looking after raising 2 kids? 3 kids?
Yeah. And...
did you have any sort of hobbies or other things?
I found it really quite boring, and I remember talking to your father about it, and there was just no one around, no one to talk to. Canberra was just settling, so I didn't know anyone around.
Well, Terry Island is around the corner.
Yeah, but I couldn't live in her pocket.
No.
So anyway, your father suggested I learn to play golf.
No, that was all. You've told us that story earlier on.
Yes, but
you came back to it
twice.
Okay. Right.
Yes, so it wasn't. I'll talk to you about it later then, if you wish.
No, I'm just saying. I'm not sure that you're confusing two the same instance, but there were 2 separate occasions when he asked you to start playing golf.
Yeah, because there really wasn't anything else for me to do around the place. It was really very dead, quiet Canberra.
Do you remember when the Monero Mall opened?
I don't remember it opening. To my knowledge, it was sort of always here, as far as I was concerned.
That was a big event, big social event in Canberra when the first modern shopping centre opened in Canberra.
Were we here for that?
Yeah, I think it was in 64, 65, yeah.
I don't remember being involved with it in any way. I obviously...
like David Jones came to Canberra,
Yeah.
That was very exciting.
Well, for some, but maybe for me it wasn't all that exciting, given I don't recollect it much. All
right, and so You were in Canberra basically for 1964, 65, or half of 64, 65, 66, and then in 1967 another posting. So just before we head off, just tell me what was going on in terms of you. Did you say to Dad, we want to go again, or?
Always.
But
because of that, I do, and that's exactly pretty well much what I said. Because I was bored rigid in this town. There was just nothing for me, and I didn't know anyone either, except Terry Island. So that was something he could do, and so I asked him if he could do something about it again, and that's when we got our second posting.
So you discussed it, the two of you, and decided that he should put his name in the ring for another posting.
Yeah, absolutely.
And did you have any choice as to where you were going?
I don't know that he did. I remember him being told it was Malta, and I didn't mind. I was happy.
So when he said Malta, did you have to pull out a map, or you already knew where Malta was?
No. Knew where Malta was.
You've been travelling up and down the Mediterranean
earlier
in your life?
Yeah. So we were aware where it was. We just knew it was small. And I remember saying to him, why can't you get postings like Paris or somewhere interesting? It was just in passing, that's all. Not knowing that eventually we would.
So the answer was Malta, and you were okay with that?
I was out of here.
Right. And so pulling yourself together, getting 3 children and everything else organised to travel to the other side of the world, that was a challenging time, no doubt?
I don't know. I was talking about it to, I think, Annette the other day, about the times that I've had to pack up house and move, that I've done it so many times. I don't remember it being a stress. When we were being posted by the government, they used to send people here and they would do all the packing, because when we were posted, we had to, in those days, you had to take all your own stuff, like your own linen, your own cutlery, glassware, all the things that you needed. When you got there, there was a furnished house, and that's all. But you had to kit it out with all of the stuff that you needed to live. And so they used to send packers here, and they would pack all my glassware and stuff like that. And all I would have to do is pack our personal things.
So it's quite a big pack. There was a lot of stuff to pack. And that was probably sent by sea, was it?
Well, we went by sea as well.
Not this time. I was just about to say.
Oh, Malta we flew.
That's right, yeah. So that was the significant difference, I think. The household material went by sea on a cargo ship, presumably.
Yeah.
For the first time, we flew to Europe. We didn't sail.
Yeah. The department was beginning to think that it was cost-saving to send their staff to fly them to postings rather than by sea, because you were there in a couple of days by air, whereas by sea it used to take us 6 weeks.
Yes, well, I remember that flight because I was 7, so I'm at the point now where I have quite clear independent memories of what's going on. And I do recall it was on BOAC, and we flew to Rome. We arrived in Rome and it was snowy.
It was.
Cold.
Very cold.
Then we flew on a smaller plane to Valletta.
That's right, we did.
But the flight to Rome was a very long one, where we spent, Annette and I, and maybe Jane as well, spent long times lying on the floor, sleeping, and being fed mountains of lollies and chocolates and all sorts of other things by the
staff. because we were flying first
We're in
class,
first class, yeah.
and we, except for one person who was a Red Cross nurse, we had the whole of the first class section to ourselves. So we could do what we wanted. I remember laying Jane out across 2 seats so that she could sleep, and I remember the air hostesses certainly made you and Annette comfortable with blankets and pillows and stuff so that you could lie around wherever you wanted. The place was ours.
Yeah. Anyway, so that was my first experience of flying. May have been yours as well, I don't know. Had you flown before that?
I'd flown before, but
Oh, you were on the flying boat.
yeah,
You talked about that flight up
Yeah.
to
up to Grafton.
Coolangatta.
Yeah. It would have been because I came to Australia by sea, so, and I didn't fly while I was overseas, so it would have been my first major flight. The one to Coolangatta was
On a
just short.
707. Those were quite remarkable planes, a bit of a breakthrough in those days.
Yeah, and given it, we had it to ourselves. It's not something you'd experience now. You know, planes are always very full.
So, before we leave Canberra entirely, I should have asked, you owned the house we were living in, didn't you?
Always.
You were paying it off, or you had already owned it outright?
We're in we bought
Government
the
Street, yeah.
yeah, we bought the house in Downer, which the government gave you houses when you came here.
You were given a house?
Well, yes, to rent.
Well, that's what I'm asking.
Yeah, given a house to rent, be it in those suburbs I told you about earlier, and we chose Downer because we had no idea where to really live in Canberra.
Yeah, but my
We had
question's about the ownership arrangement. Did you own the house?
Yeah, you had to. It was available to you. Some people chose to just rent them. We rented for a while, and then we thought, let's buy it.
So you were in the process of buying the house. You hadn't bought it outright at that stage. You had a mortgage, presumably.
Yeah, and when we went overseas again, we were still in that house in Downer.
So you set up your own tenants, or did you find the government find somebody for you?
No, I found an agent, Jean Singer, and she looked after the house while we were away. Would send us messages if things needed to be done or whatever. But we rented it while we were away, as we owned it.
Right. So that house was rented for 4 years while we were living in Europe. Right. Okay.
And then when we came back, I thought it had shrunk.
Yeah, I get that. We'll come to that, but I'm just interested in what the situation was with the house when we left. It was a house that you were buying that had a mortgage attached to it, and when you were away there were tenants in the house, and that they were being looked after by a local real estate agent, Jean Singer, who you ended up
Yeah, and we were lucky.
working for later on.
The same tenants stayed there for the whole time.
The whole 4 years. Okay, well, that's good. All right, so I just want to talk about your early few weeks in Malta. Did you, again, have to live in a kind of a hostel situation, or was there a place available straight away?
No, we had to live in a hotel in Malta. Again, it took a while. Eventually, we ended up with like a semi-detached house, a 3-bedroom house, but it was attached to another. The other half had British Navy people in it, and then there was a footpath between us and the next place, which was again British Army.
So this was in the suburb of St Julian's, is that right? Or no, it was the one next door to it. What was the name of it? Starts with an S.
Yes.
Sana, something like that.
Yeah, it doesn't come to me. I was thinking about it the other day. It'll come. You're right. Begins with an S. It's on the tip of my tongue,
It's a suburb right next to St Julian's.
Yeah, yeah.
And we had a house with a nice view out over the water, didn't we, if I recall?
We did, and we could see Russian ships actually sailing out on. Obviously, they couldn't come too close to Malta, but you could see them sailing by, and of course, Malta was still a big harbour. The Brits still used it a bit, but of course not like it did during the war.
So Malta was a former British possession which had become an independent country, but there was still quite a significant British presence there, wasn't there?
Well, as I just told you, they were living left and right of us where we had our accommodation. There were Brits, and I got the impression that the Brits liked it so much, if they had worked there or been there with the armed forces or whatever, a lot of them chose to retire in Malta.
Well, it was nice weather.
Nice weather. They could get cheap domestic help. They could live a nice life, and their money went a bit further, they thought.
Yes. Well, and it was set up, there was English was spoken by a lot of people. It was in it was one of the languages that was...
Well, I can remember the domestic help we had in Malta. They all spoke fluent English.
Mm. The other thing which is remarkable about Malta is that it was very badly damaged and attacked in the Second World War.
Yeah.
And that the whole of the island had been pummeled with German bombing for many, many months, years in fact, and that at the end of the war, in recognition of their significant national effort to support the British war effort, the whole country was awarded the George Cross.
That's right.
Which still is, if you look at the national flag of Malta, they still have the George Cross on their national flag.
And why wouldn't they? They're very proud of... It must have been awful because, being that the Brits used Malta as a harbour for their ships and warships and whatever, those people must have been pummeled something terrible.
Mm. So the area we lived in was obviously an area that had lots of foreigners, probably British people. It wasn't an area that was lived in by lots of local Maltese. Although I have recollections of there being local Maltese people not too far away, just around the corner and down the street.
Mm. You're right, because as I just said, the people that were living around us were British military personnel. And then also the head of the department in Malta, the Robinsons, were living at the back of us. In fact, they could look down into our area from where they were. Given it was such a small posting, there weren't many of us around.
Yeah, although Malta has turned out to be an important place for Australia in terms of its immigration. There was a large migration of Maltese to Australia.
Yeah, I can remember my mother having a friendship with a Maltese lady. They used to share their Mediterranean recipes.
Yeah, but the Maltese surnames, so you still hear them around Australia, like
Caruana.
Caruana.
Yeah,
Borg.
He was in your school.
Borg is another Maltese name, and Fenech is another name. That's a Maltese name as well. Fenec. Actually.
Yeah, I've heard it, but it's a Caruana, of course, I'm well aware of. But the other names, I know I've obviously heard them around, and I knew that there were quite a few Maltese.
So Dad must have been pretty busy at the immigration office there.
I think it was, and it was a happy immigration office. But then again, we weren't there very long.
Mm. So you looked around and found a British naval school to send me and Annette to, called Vidala. So was that the only real option available, or did you consider other things?
I don't think there was any other option, actually. If there was, it wasn't presented to me. I guess having one British school on a small place like Malta would be adequate.
So we were packed off and became sort of plummy British naval kids.
Well, you did. You picked up their accent very quickly.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the other significant event I recall personally about being in Malta was that was where I had my first communion.
Yes, we have photos of you all dressed in white.
Which is, being the kind of country that it is, very Catholic and very, Southern European Catholic. It was a big deal.
Oh yeah, First Communion and Confirmation. I'm not sure if it's there or France, and I'm thinking of my own history where Confirmation came first and then Holy Communion. And they used to have big parties for those sort of things, that when their child was either confirmed or had Holy Communion.
Well, we had a party for my first communion, I remember.
Yes, well, we did what the natives did, I guess.
I was in I don't think the school probably wasn't Catholic. Vidala probably wasn't a Catholic school, so I'm not sure where I was getting my tuition. Maybe it was at the cathedral or something. But
I'm not quite. I thought it might. I don't know that it was a Catholic school, but I think priests or nuns or whatever went to that school and provided your religious education, and it happened that way.
That could be right. I don't recall going to a separate location.
No, you didn't.
But I do recall getting a bit of training or tuition about, the significance of First Communion and that sort of thing. And we had an au pair as well, who was living in the house with us.
In Malta?
Yes.
No, Malta they didn't have to. It was in Paris they lived in. In Malta we had Doris, remember?
I do remember.
And she used to come and go daily. She lived at home.
Oh, okay, right. I thought we had a little, servants.
No, we didn't.
That definitely was the case in Paris.
And it was very easy in Malta for them to do that, being so small. I think she just used a bus service, came backwards and forwards.
And another famous event from that time was when I had the unfortunate experience of crossing the street where there was a sort of an abandoned sort of
building block
or something, anyway. And I remember there was a wall and it dropped down onto a sort of an open area which was full of nettles. And somehow or other I managed to fall off the wall and roll literally across a whole patch of nettles.
It was shocking.
And I was stung from head to toe, wasn't I?
Oh, yeah. And Annette had a horrible feeling that she knocked you or something and that's how you fell, but that's not your memory, is it? You fell yourself?
I don't recall. I think it may have been me just being stupid.
Yeah. I remember you were screaming in pain because nettle stinging is terrible. We'd never met that sort of thing in Australia. There aren't nettles in Australia.
Not like those ones in Europe. And I was probably only wearing shorts and a t-shirt.
I don't know. I remember grabbing you, taking you home and plunging you in a really cold bath. And I put vinegar and stuff like that. I was trying to do everything to reduce pain. It was awful, awful.
Well, I still remember it to this day, so that definitely made an impression.
We all remember it to this day.
The other thing I do recall is, as I said, there were local Maltese people not too far away, because I remember going around the corner and down the street a little bit, and I must have been with somebody that I knew, because I was taken into one of the houses down there.
Right, maybe his girlfriend.
And I remember it being quite different to where we were living. It was darker and more sort of closed in, and there were these strong smells of the cooking and all that sort of thing, which felt very exotic, but It was a memory that I still recall.
Yeah, it's interesting. I always thought, even though Malta was small, it would have been a good posting and we would have enjoyed it. And I certainly wanted to get around and have a look at the place. But I can remember the head of the posting, Gwen, saying to me, "Come on, Margaret, don't rush it. You've got 3 years to see this place in. So I only saw a few places, got around, saw a few places before. I think we were only there about 6 months.
Yeah. Well, we did visit Gozo, the island, which was just off to the...
Well, we made an effort to see a few places before we left.
And that was a famous place because it had the St. Paul's Cave, which was allegedly where St. Paul had been shipwrecked back in the 1st century.
Yeah.
And had to live for a period of time. And that was a thing which the Maltese thought was a very important sort of religious site in their island, wasn't it?
Yeah, it certainly was to the Maltese. Gozo was that. It was just a little island off the mainland. No, we didn't see as much as I would have liked to see.
Well, the other memory I have clearly, and I'm sure you do even better, is the...
Good Friday.
Is the Holy Week. Up in the village, up in the centre of the island there was a famous Holy Week sort of procession where people came out carrying the statues from the churches, but all the penitents carrying chains, and it was all rather kind of gruesome, wasn't it?
Yeah, we weren't expecting it. But, you know, when I think back, they were doing what a lot of those religious countries like Italy and Malta and places like that, where they celebrated, and it was Good Friday, so they were celebrating the Stations of the Cross, and also they had what they called penitents, and these penitents used to dress in what I thought looked like Ku Klux Klan outfits. They were all white
with hoods.
Yeah, which reminded me of that sort of thing. And I remember Jane was not quite 2, nearly 2, because she turned 2 in Paris. She was 1 3/4 or whatever. And one of these men, they not only wore those hooded cloaks, but they were pulling chains, and it was really quite gruesome, and carrying crosses. And one of these guys looked at Jane because she was sitting on your father's shoulders so that she could see things, and he absolutely spooked her. She just let out a scream, and your father had to take her away and calm her down.
So she's been scarred for life.
Of people in white hoods, you mean?
Anyway, so it was not a long time in Malta, but it was quite memorable in some ways, wasn't it?
It was nice. Yeah, it was nice for the time that we were there.
And you were happy to be out of Australia?
Yep, I was doing things that I wanted to do. The thing about postings is you go to a community of people, whereas when you come to Canberra, there is no community.
Right. So you found a community of Australians and other countries and sort of got...
Yeah, and that leads you to other things, like our neighbours that were English. We got to know them well enough to entertain them, have dinner with them, they had dinner with us, and do things like that, which really never happened in Canberra.
And when did you hear you were going to be cross-posted to Paris?
We were there only about 6 months, and it was, I don't know why your father wasn't home, but he wasn't. I picked up the phone, and it was Peter Robinson, who was the head of the post.
The migration post?
Yeah, in Malta. And he started singing Paris in the Springtime. And I sort of wondered what he was on about. And he said to me, "How would you like Paris in the springtime?" I said, "Peter, what are you on about?" He said, "How would you like Paris in the springtime?" I said, "Peter, I would love Paris in the springtime." He said, "Good, because you're going." That's how we heard.
Okay. So
I was highly delighted, as you can imagine.
Not that Malta was all that bad.
No, but Paris was one step up, wasn't
It
it?
was definitely better. So we arrived in Paris in May of 1967 because, as you said, Jane had her second birthday there.
In Paris.
So we'd only been in Malta maybe 5 months or 4 months.
Not long.
Not a very long time at all.
No, to get cross-posted.
So you had to pack up again and do all that stuff?
Yep.
But that was okay with you?
Well, I didn't really have the house to do. It was just our personal stuff. And again, I presume we would have got assistance when it came to the bric-a-brac. And we just had to pack our own gear, clothing and stuff like that. Look, it became a habit with me to be able to move house and just move on. I guess
Becomes the thing you do.
Well, I did it as a child. I just sort of spent a life moving around, I guess. So for me, it wasn't a really big deal.
Okay, so we flew to Paris, is that right? We arrived presumably at Orly Airport.
Mm-hmm.
And then we moved and started our time in Paris at the Bedford Hotel, which was near the Madeleine Church in the middle of Paris, in the second arrondissement.
Yeah, we spent a fair amount of time there because we found it very difficult to find accommodation.
This predates the time when the Australian embassy that is there now was built. So that didn't exist at that time.
It was being built while we were there, actually. And I was so grateful we weren't there once it was built. I would hate to live in that sort of a commune. Where, when we went there, it was surprising the office never did anything about searching for accommodation before you arrived. That became your chore. And maybe it was a good idea. You ended up getting what you wanted. But it was very difficult to find accommodation in Paris at the time. And the first place we found was a house in Vaucresson.
La Sainte-Saint-Cloud.
Yeah, near Vaucresson.
On the border.
Yeah.
It's very exactly on the border.
Yeah. They called it Vaucresson at the time, but then also La Sainte-Saint-Cloud. And we were there for a little while. Again, it was outside of town. You were able to get to British school from there, but eventually a place came up in Saint-Cloud, which I thought seemed a whole lot better. It was not a house, it was an apartment. And when it became vacant, we requested if we could move to that, and the department allowed it.
That had been a place where another Australian family had been living, is that right?
No, it was British. And
well, listen, I want to ask you about some things before that, so we'll come back to that. So when we arrived in Paris, we were in May of 1967, and you and Dad looked at the schooling options for me and Annette and decided to send us to the British School of Paris. Do you remember that?
Yeah, because you used to get picked up in the Concorde, remember, under the horses?
Under the horses, just at the top of the Champs-Élysées.
Yeah.
And the bus would pick us up and take us to school and then bring us back in the afternoon. And it was only a fairly short walk from there to the hotel. But we lived in the hotel for well over a month.